Shields and swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Hello, minions. Welcome back to Professor Awesome and the Minions of Doom. However, today is actually part of my mini lecture series that I do for my classes, and this one is on Othello, Shakespeare's play Othello. So if you're hoping for a lot of hot takes, you're probably not going to hear those today. It'll be more of kind of your standard little mini lecture on that. So Othello is one of my favorite plays. It's not a big surprise. Since Othello is one of everyone's favorite plays from Shakespeare. I mean, if you say that another one of my favorite plays, for example, is Coriolanus, that one's a kind of, unorthodox pick. Othello certainly is not. Now, Shakespeare holds, I think, an outsized role in our culture. And it sounds like maybe I'm throwing some shade on him and saying Shakespeare wasn't that great or anything. Shakespeare really was great. But there really is no one who has the cultural position that he has. Even people like, say, John Milton, who, would be as great or possibly even greater than Shakespeare. I mean, that's debatable. But, if you were to sort of try to find some way to quantify their quality versus the position that they have in our culture, I think there's really no one who gets the position Shakespeare has. My favorite example of this are the Astor Place riots of 1849. 1849, there were these two competing performances of Macbeth, or kind of parts of Macbeth, between two different actors in two different theaters and in New York. And one group of these one group of kind of rougher people who literally are the kinds of people, if you've ever seen Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York, those people, the Bowery Boys, are one of the gangs that are in that. That's a real historical gang that is part of this. And they were so riled up by a different way of performing Shakespeare than their preferred kind, that these two competing performances got whipped up in this frenzy until there were literally riots. And riots it's not a couple people of waving signs and shouting or throwing rocks. No, it was so big, the Astor Place riots were so big that they had to call out the National Guard, who then not quite National Guard as we think of them today, had to call it the Guard. And in the end of it, I think 22 people were dead at the end of these. So they were serious riots. And it all had to do with someone performed Shakespeare in a way that we don't like. Not to say they didn't like Shakespeare. They liked it performed in a different way. So particular to Othello, though, I want to talk about, the race issue in really late 19th and through 20th and early 21st century America. Othello has really been cast as a play about race. There was this kind of what's called the Bronze Era, where Shakespeare, where Othello was usually played by white actors wearing a kind of bronze face, or we'd call it a black face, though really isn't the kind of minstrelly blackface. It was more of a way to make them look swarthy and Middle Eastern. And although I think one of the great strengths of Shakespeare is the ability to cast Shakespeare in a variety of different ways. You can change the setting, you can change how you use the different actors, all sorts of things like that. I think in this case, we've sort of leaned way too far in that direction. We want to see it from the American perspective of being really almost solely about race, and I think would be an interesting and quirky reading, but I think it's become so dominant that it's almost come to the point of a misreading. I think instead it's important to think about Othello, not in the sense of him being black, in the sense of a kind of West African, a kind of a person of West African descent in America, but rather in the sense of being foreign. The idea of being a Moor means you're foreign in some way, not just North African instead of West African. We're not just talking about hues of skin, but rather the role that person would hold in society. And this is someone who really is a kind of outsider who's risen in the society that he's in. And Shakespeare has set this in Venice, and he sets other plays in Venice as well. And Venice really seems to be a kind of foreign but cosmopolitan place, a place that is still European, so recognizable in that way, but it's so cosmopolitan. So the idea, I think, that a Moor could have risen to the level that he has in England would probably not be accepted by Shakespeare's audience as realistic. However, the idea that a Moor could in cosmopolitan Venice, that's something that people can buy. And so I think when we're looking at Othello, I think we need to look at him as the outsider, no matter how we understand that outsider, whether we understand it from a kind of American ideal or some other ideal. I actually think that's one of the problems with the American reading of him as a kind of black American, is that there's a sense in which the black American story is very much still an American story. It's not quite the foreign story. You can say, like, you can think about black Americans as being outsiders, but really black Americans are not outsiders in the same way as so many other groups, which end up being invisible groups. We have fought a civil war over issues that pertain to slavery of black people. There are all sorts of contentious social issues that have risen and fallen over the last 2 centuries, involving all sorts of other peoples, indigenous peoples, for example, Native American Indians, and we didn't fight civil wars over them. So the idea that we fought a civil war over it ironically demonstrates how kind of central it is to the American identity rather than outside the American identity. And this is why I don't think that's a great reading for Americans. So when I'm talking about Othello, I'm not actually interested in that element of it. But one thing I'm interested in for Othello really is the way that Shakespeare uses his audience's plays with his audience's perceptions. So what Shakespeare is doing is something very interesting with Othello. He's taking a guy who has murdered his wife, and not murdered his wife, of many years with a lot of, built up years of trouble and acrimony between them. No, a woman he has just married a couple days earlier, and he kills her in their bed. And he, on top of that, he is the foreigner, the outsider, someone who's so outside of this that her father objects to the marriage at all. And we're supposed to sympathize with him. That, I think, is a pretty bold move for a playwright. It's very audacious play. When we think about Shakespeare's major tragedies, or any of his major plays, I think this one is the one where he takes something that is really an indefensible character. He puts them as an outsider to make them even more indefensible, even more foreign, even more frightening. And then he sets the audience up to defend them, the audience up to sympathize with them, so that even in the end, if we read Othello as being still self-absorbed, still thinking about himself, we understand him better, and we don't see him as the great villain, even though he's the killer in this case. And how does he do that? Well, I think the way that he does that is by putting his audience from the beginning in Othello's mindset. So you see, from the very beginning, so the way that, of course, Iago persuades Othello, I guess tricks him, rather persuades him into murdering his wife, is that Iago basically plays with his sense of perception, causing him to overhear things that he doesn't understand, half hear things, dwell on rumors until finally he becomes convinced that his wife has cheated on him. And how does he get the audience to not just dismiss him as being kind of paranoid in some way? Well, let's think about the very beginning. Let me read you the first lines of the poem, of the play. The first line is opened by Rodrigo. Rodrigo says, "Tush, never tell me." Okay, we start right there. Never tell me. We're coming in the middle of a conversation. So the audience enters into a half overheard conversation. We have missed the first half. We don't know what they're talking about. Okay. And so from the very beginning, we're confused. I take it much kindly that thou, Iago, so Rodrigo identifies the other guy as Iago, who has had my purse as if the strings were thine, shouldst know of this. But see, the audience, we don't know what this is yet. And Iago, when he responds to that, his response is, "Splud, but you'll not hear me. If ever I did dream of such a matter, abhor me." Such a matter? What is this? What is such a matter? We don't know, and we're not going to find out for some time. The audience is going to be confused. I think it's intentional. Rodrigo says, "Thou toldst me thou didst hold him in thy hate." Oh, who's him? We don't know. Rodrigo has named Iago, but he hasn't named the person who Iago said that he hated. So we don't know who he's talking about yet. Iago responds, "Despise me if I do not. 3 great ones of the city in personal suit to make me his lieutenant." Okay. We assume this is the person who we just heard as him before. "Off kept to him." Again, not named. "And by the faith of man, I know my price. I'm worth no worse a place. But he, as loving his own pride and purposes, evades them with bombast circumstance, horribly stuffed with epithets of war. And in conclusion, none search my mediators for certs, says he, I have already chosen my officer. And what was he? Forsooth, a great arithmetician, one Michael Cassio, a Florentine, a fellow almost damned in a fair wife." And I think here we see here, he, him, he, and later on we know that this is all about Othello. But when he switches to say, "And what was he?" he's actually not talking about Othello anymore. But that's not clear from the context. And so when he says, "Forsooth, a great arithmetician, one Michael Cassio, a Florentine," the audience, would be forgiven for thinking, "Oh, Michael Cassio is the person we've been talking about this whole time." Not that Michael Cassio was the person who was promoted over Iago. And then, of course, he defines Michael Cassio as a fellow almost damned in a fair wife. Michael Cassio's wife is not a character in this play, but a character who is almost damned in a fair wife is Othello. And so, again, there's this kind of confusion. And so unless the audience is already really familiar with the story of Othello, it's not their first time through, Shakespeare creates this sense of confusion throughout. And he does this sort of thing throughout. When Iago tells Brabantio about he goes to announce what's going on, and the audience still does not know at this point. Iago says, "Are your doors locked?" Brabantio says, "Why, wherefore ask you this?" Iago says, "Zound, sir, you are robbed. For shame, put on your gown. Your heart is burst. You've lost half your soul. Even now, very now, an old black ram is tupping your white ewe. Arise, arise, awake the snorting citizens with the bell, or else the devil will make a grandsire of you. Arise, I say." And Brabantio replies, What? Have you lost your wits? Again, we have here, even the characters within are like, I don't know what's going on. What are you even talking about? And we, the audience, we also don't know what he's talking about, because we're not even going to get Othello's name until the third scene when someone calls him this. There's a moment later on in Act 1, Scene 2. Now, Othello has shown up, but he's not been named, and it's still not clear what's going on, where Cassio is talking to Iago about what's going on, and Cassio says, I do not understand. Iago says, he's married. And Cassio replies, to who? And Othello walks back in, and Iago says, married to, and then he gets interrupted and says, come, Captain, will you go? So even at this point, when Iago seems like he's about to actually give a straight answer for the audience and for the rest of us, we don't get a straight answer from him. And so I think what Shakespeare does is he plays with our sense of expectation. And because of that, when we do see Othello himself being tricked by what's going on, we see him not certain what's happening. We as the audience too have been in the same situation, so we're way more sympathetic to him than we might have been otherwise. Another thing which I find really fascinating about Othello, and I won't dwell too long on this, is really the role of the female characters. It strikes me that we have 3 female characters of varying degrees of importance. The play in terms of like lines really focuses on the male characters. But I think in terms of the story, the position of the female characters is, to me, much more interesting and much more important. You've got Desdemona, Emilia, and Bianca. And in these, we've got sort of 3 representations of 3 roles that women can play in society. You've got Desdemona, who's really the virgin in this. And we understand that she probably has now consummated her marriage with her husband, but sort of this has begun just as she's sort of fallen out of that virgin phase. And we still see her in many conversations as the kind of innocent. Next we have Emilia, who's a wife who's very faithful in certain ways to Iago, and in other ways she's unfaithful to him. So at one point, for example, she says, they're having a conversation, she and Desdemona are having a conversation about cheating on your husband, and Emilia says, yeah, I mean, it's a small thing if you could like get him socially advanced. And so she says, like, I would cheat on him, I guess, under the right circumstances. Well, we are not certain. She later on tells Iago says, has been saying that he heard that there's a rumor going around that Emilia had slept with Othello, and she's like, that's not true. That's a false rumor. Maybe. But we also know it's the kind of thing she would do. I suppose if there's any evidence it's a false rumor, it's that he didn't get the promotion that he was wanting. Though I suppose there's a reading of this that says that maybe Iago's true rage isn't just being passed over, but he believes that his wife slept with with Othello to get him the promotion, and he still didn't get it. That's unclear because it's hard to trust what Iago says about himself. On the other hand, we can't cast Emilia as I'm so faithful to my husband, I would even sleep with someone else to advance him, because she's the one who, in the end, points the finger at Iago and says, nope, he's the one who did it, and I'm not going to shut up, and I'm going to rat out my husband. This isn't right, what's happened. And then we have Bianca, who is this she's a prostitute. And so she's cast in the sort of the far end of social acceptability, and yet she really is being treated badly by Cassio, and actually the other male characters seem to think, everyone seems to understand that she's a prostitute because she's in a bad situation, except Cassio, who treats her really badly, and she just responds by loving him. And we have this kind of, each of these 3 women in the story love unwisely. And I think that Othello, in the end, when he basically says that his problem was that he loved unwisely. too well. That while he's still focused on himself, even after he's killed his wife, who I would hope should be his real focus in this, that also describes all three women in this. All three women who suffer, or in two cases die, because of their love for the wrong man or for dangerous men. Anyway, there's so much to be said about Othello. I'm 20 minutes in, so I'm going to leave it off here. So I guess I would say, finally, if there's a central symbol to this, it's the handkerchief. The handkerchief is described in Act 3, Scene 4, the story of magic and seduction. And when you see that, there's a way, I think, of looking at what happens and thinking, well, maybe it's not so absurd that people think that Othello has seduced first Desdemona through magic, and then later that he himself feels like he's had the wool pulled over his eyes. And then finally, in the end, that Shakespeare, using the magic of stagecraft in a really well-crafted play, is able to seduce the audience to sympathize with this man who's done the unpardonable and killed his own wife.